What if the one you loved most disappeared without a trace, vanished in a heartbeat, leaving behind only echoes of a life you thought would last forever? Imagine a loyal soul waiting in the shadows, year after year, clinging to a scent, a sound, a memory that refuses to fade. This is the story of Max, a German shepherd who spent a decade adrift, lost in a world that forgot him, abandoned by time itself. 10 long years of silent longing, until one ordinary day, a stranger walked through a shelter door, and the past came rushing back in a way no one could predict. What happened to tear them apart? How did they find each other against all odds? And what secret waited in that reunion? A secret so powerful it will grip your heart and leave you breathless. Stay with us, because this isn't just a tale of a dog and a woman, it's a mystery of love, loss, and a bond that defied the impossible. A dog sat quietly in the darkness, waiting for someone who would never return. It longed for a scent that had faded over the years, a gentle voice that once echoed in its ears, a warm home now reduced to a hazy memory. Max, a German shepherd, had lived with that yearning for 10 long years, a decade spent drifting through unfamiliar rooms and cold iron kennels, where no one lingered long enough to look into its sorrowful eyes. But then, on a day that seemed utterly ordinary, the shelter door swung open, and a woman stepped in, bringing with her a light Max thought it would never see again. What happened next will melt your heart, blur your eyes with tears, and in the end, leave you in silent awe. That morning, the shelter was steeped in a weary stillness. The air was thick with the damp smell of concrete, tinged with the sharp sting of disinfectant, the scent of a place that held abandoned hopes. In the farthest corner, where the light from the window barely reached, Max lay curled up on an old, tattered dog bed. At 13, it was no longer the majestic dog that once bounded across fields. Its once thick coat was now dull, patchy, matted from long days of neglect. Its muzzle had turned white, its ears drooped like wilted petals, no longer perking up at the sound of footsteps or a name being called. Its deep brown eyes, once sparkling with life, now gazed blankly at the iron door, the same door where it had watched hundreds of other dogs leave, prancing off with new owners, while it remained behind, forgotten. Max had been there too long, so long that the shelter staff had stopped counting the days. The Adopt Me posters by its kennel had yellowed and peeled, ignored and never replaced. No one wanted an old dog, a dog with a slow gait, whose size seemed to carry the weight of the world. They didn't know, and perhaps didn't care, that Max had once had a beautiful story. 10 years ago, it lived in a small house on the edge of a village, where the smoke from the fireplace mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread each evening. It had a family, and above all, it had her, the woman who, to Max, was its entire universe. She called it her hero, leading it down leaf-strewn paths, tossing a ball for it to chase under the glow of the sunset. At night, when thunder rumbled, she sat beside it, her hands stroking its thick fur, whispering, "Don't be afraid, Max, I'm here." Her scent, a blend of lavender perfume and the warmth of an old wool sweater, was its sanctuary, its very definition of home. But then, one fateful afternoon, it all vanished. A fire erupted from somewhere in the kitchen, spreading fast like a nightmare. Max remembered her scream, her voice breaking in panic. "Max, run!" It didn't want to run, but the thick smoke choked its lungs, and strange hands dragged it out, shoving it into a rescue truck. It growled, scratched, and twisted its head back, only to see the house engulfed in flames and her silhouette fading into the black smoke. That was the last time it saw her. Now, in the cold iron kennel, Max blinked slowly, memories flooding back like a wave before receding, leaving it with an empty reality. It had passed through so many homes after that fire, families who took it in and then returned it because it was too sad, it wouldn't play. It had lain on countless unfamiliar floors, sniffing scents that weren't hers, waiting for a miracle it no longer believed in. People came to the shelter, their eyes lighting up at the sight of playful puppies, but with Max, they only glanced over, sometimes sighing. "Poor thing, but I want a healthy dog." Max stretched its legs, a sharp pain shooting through its aged joints. It wondered, did she still remember it? Did she ever think of the dog that once slept by her feet every night? With a deep, heavy sigh, it rested its head on the floor, eyes half closed, bracing for another meaningless day to pass. But today, fate took a different turn. The shelter door creaked open, a gust of cold air rushing in, carrying the rustle of leaves from outside. Max didn't bother lifting its head. This scene had played out hundreds of times, and it was never for it. But then, a scent wafted through, soft, faint, like a call from a distant dream. Its ears twitched, the first movement in years. Claire Walker stepped inside, rubbing her arms to ward off the morning chill. She wore a worn old coat, her hair loosely tied and tousled by the wind. She didn't know why she was here. For 10 years she had lived with an unhealed wound in her heart. The day the fire took her home, took Max, the best friend she could never forget. Claire had spent months searching after the fire, racing to every shelter, plastering flyers across town, crying until her voice gave out as she asked, "Have you seen my dog?" But no one knew. She wove a story to comfort herself, that Max had been saved by someone, that it was living happily somewhere with a new ball and a green yard. But every night, when nightmares of the fire returned, she saw Max's brown eyes staring at her through the smoke, and she woke up in tears, wondering, "Did I abandon him?" Today, she came to the shelter not to find Max. She had given up that hope long ago, but to find something to close the ache in her soul. She walked slowly past the kennels, her gaze drifting over wagging tails and the cheerful barks that greeted her like a chorus. But in the far corner, a still figure made her stop. Max caught the scent more clearly now, lavender, wool, and something unmistakably hers. Its eyes opened, its heart pounding as if it might burst. It lifted its head, slowly, trembling, and then saw her. Claire stood there, her breath catching in her throat. Those brown eyes, aged, weary, but still the same eyes that had gazed at her every morning with pure joy. "No," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "It can't be." Max let out a moan, a deep, quivering sound, as if 10 years of waiting, 10 years of loneliness spilled out in that single moment. Its body shook, struggling to stand though its legs were weak and nearly gave out. Claire rushed forward, dropping to her knees before the kennel, her trembling hand reaching through the bars to touch its gaunt face. "Max?" she called, her voice breaking. Its tail moved, just a faint wag, but to Claire, it was everything. She burst into tears, yanking the kennel door open and pulling it into her arms, her forehead pressed against its own. "I found you," she sobbed, tears soaking its silver fur. "I'm sorry, Max, I'm so sorry I lost you." Max closed its eyes, its breathing shaky but warm. Her scent enveloped it, pulling it back to those old days. It didn't have to wait anymore. She was here, and she had never forgotten it. But that joy was abruptly interrupted. A hesitant voice broke through. "Ma'am, I'm afraid." Claire looked up to see a shelter worker, a young girl in a blue uniform, standing there, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" Claire asked, her voice trembling, her arms still wrapped tightly around Max. The worker sighed, glancing at Max and then back at Claire. "It's been here a long time, over 4 years. No one wanted to adopt it. It's old, its health is poor, we were planning to take it away this weekend." Claire felt her blood turn to ice. "Take it away?" she repeated, her voice choking. "You mean, put it down?" The worker lowered her head, saying nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Max let out a soft whimper, pressing its head into Claire's hand as if sensing her fear. "No," Claire snapped, tears streaming down her face. "You can't do that. I'm taking it home." The worker hesitated. "But there's paperwork, medical tests. It's very weak, are you sure? I don't care." Claire interrupted, her voice firm despite the quiver. "I lost it once. I won't lose it again. Please help me bring it home." Max lifted its head, its cloudy eyes meeting hers, as if it understood that this time, she wouldn't leave. The process of taking Max home wasn't easy. Claire sat for hours, signing every paper, paying for tests she knew Max might not pass. But she didn't care. She just wanted it by her side, even if only for one more day. When they finally left the shelter, Claire lifted Max into the car, It was lighter than she'd expected, its body so frail it seemed little more than skin over bones. She drove slowly, her eyes never straying from it in the rearview mirror, terrified that if she blinked, it might vanish again. Claire's new home wasn't the old one the fire had claimed. It was a small house nestled among trees, where sunlight flickered through the leaves. She carried Max inside, setting it down on the soft rug in the living room. Max hesitated, sniffing the unfamiliar air, no trace of fireplace smoke, no echo of laughter from the kitchen. Its ears drooped, its eyes searching. Claire knelt beside it, whispering, "This is your new home, Max? I'm here with you." It looked at her, then slowly lay down, not because it felt familiar, but because she was there. In those first days, Max was like a ghost. It slept most of the time, its breathing faint, its body trembling whenever it tried to stand. Claire stayed close, recounting old stories, the days they raced across fields, the rainy nights they listened to thunder together. One morning, she heard a soft scratching at the door. Max was there, head bowed low, its claws lightly brushing the wood. She feared it wanted to leave, but then realized it was waiting, just like it used to, waiting for her to take it outside. "You don't have to wait anymore," she said, stroking it. Max leaned into her hand, and for the first time, she saw a spark flicker in its eyes. Weeks passed, and Max began to come back to life. One day, Claire led it into the yard. It stood on the porch, nose lifted to breathe in the fresh air, sunlight warming its silver fur. Then, slowly, it stepped onto the grass, the first time in years it had felt anything but cold concrete beneath its paws. It sniffed the earth and let out a quiet sigh, a sound of contentment Claire had never heard before. That night, she woke to an unfamiliar sensation. Max had climbed onto the bed on its own, curling up by her feet. She cried, her hand running over its fur. "Welcome home, buddy," she whispered. One afternoon, beneath a brilliant sunset, they sat together on the porch. Max rested its head in Claire's lap, its tail wagging gently, its brown eyes gazing at her with unspoken love. After 10 years apart, they had found each other again. But Max's story isn't just a miracle, it's a reminder that out there, thousands of dogs like Max are still waiting, locked in cold iron kennels, hoping that one day someone will open the door. If this tale has stirred your heart, consider adopting an older dog. Their time may be short, but their love is eternal. Share this story, because every small act could bring another Max home. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender, Claire and Max sat together on the weathered wooden porch of her small home. The air carried the faint scent of pine from the surrounding trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, whispering secrets of the fading day. Max rested his head in Claire's lap, his frail body pressed close to her, seeking the warmth he'd missed for so long. His silver fur caught the golden light, and his tail, once still for years, wagged faintly, a quiet rhythm of peace. His deep brown eyes, though clouded by age, gazed up at her with a love so pure it needed no words, a love that had endured 10 years of separation, countless lonely nights, and the slow march of time. Claire ran her fingers gently through his patchy coat, feeling the fragile rise and fall of his chest. She smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she traced the familiar lines of his face, lines etched by a decade apart, yet still so dear to her. "You waited for me, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Beside her, on the porch table, sat a faded photograph she'd found in an old box days before, a snapshot of a younger Max, his coat glossy and black, leaping after a ball in their old backyard, with Claire laughing beside him. She'd kept it all these years, a fragile tether to a past she thought she'd lost forever. Now, as she looked from the photo to the old dog in her lap, she saw the same spirit, unbroken despite the years. After 10 years of being lost to each other, through fire, through chaos, through the silent despair of shelters and strangers, they had found their way back. Max had survived abandonment, rejection, and the creeping shadow of time, holding on to a hope Claire hadn't dared to dream was possible. She thought of the nights she'd spent staring at the stars after the fire, whispering his name into the dark, praying he was safe somewhere. And he had been waiting, in his quiet, steadfast way, for her to come claim him. Their reunion wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a testament to a bond that refused to break, a love that defied the odds. But Max's story doesn't end with this tender moment. It's more than a single miracle. It's a quiet, urgent echo from every shelter across the world, where thousands of dogs like Max sit in cold iron kennels, their eyes tracing the footsteps of strangers who pass them by. Claire thought of the other dogs she'd seen that day at the shelter, the ones with hopeful wags and pleading stares, the ones whose posters had faded just like Max's. She remembered a little terrier with a graying muzzle, its tail thumping weakly against the bars, and a shaggy mutt who'd pressed its nose to the gate, watching her leave with Max. How many of them were still waiting, their stories untold, their hearts yearning for a home they might never know. If this tale has touched you, Claire's voice seemed to carry on the wind, a silent plea to anyone listening. Don't let it stop here. Think of the old dogs, the ones with stiff legs and tired eyes, the ones who've given their youth to families who left them behind. Their time may be short, but their capacity to love is endless. She pulled Max closer, feeling his warmth against her, and thought of how little it had taken to change his fate. A single choice, a moment of courage. Adopt one, she urged, her words soft but fierce. Give them a chance to feel the sun on their fur, the softness of a bed, the sound of a voice calling their name with love. Share Max's story, tell it to a friend, whisper it to the world, because every small act, every open heart, could bring another Max home. As the last light of day slipped below the horizon, Claire leaned down and pressed a kiss to Max's forehead. You're my miracle, she said, her voice breaking as a tear fell onto his fur. Max let out a soft sigh, his eyes fluttering closed, and in that moment, they were no longer just a woman and her dog. They were a promise kept, a story finished, and a call to the world to remember the ones still waiting. As the golden hues of the sunset faded into twilight, Claire sat on the porch, Max's head resting gently in her lap. His breathing was slow now, a quiet rhythm that matched the rustling leaves in the evening breeze. His gray muzzle pressed against her hand, and his tail, once still for so long, gave a faint, contented wag. 10 years of longing, of loss, of silent waiting had led them here, to this moment of fragile, beautiful peace. Claire's fingers traced the lines of his worn face, feeling every scar of time, every whisper of the past they'd shared. We made it, didn't we? She murmured, her voice breaking as tears slipped down her cheeks. Max's eyes, dim but warm, met hers one last time, and in that gaze she saw it all, the fields they'd run through, the storms they'd weathered, the unbreakable bond that even fire couldn't destroy. A few days later, Max slipped away quietly in his sleep, curled up on the soft rug by Claire's side, her hands still resting on his back. He didn't leave her in despair, though. He left her with a heart full of gratitude, a soul healed by the miracle of their reunion. He'd waited a decade for her, and she'd fought to bring him home, if only for a fleeting season. In his final breath, Max knew he was loved, that he'd never been forgotten, that his story mattered. But this isn't just Max's story, it's a whisper from every shelter, every cold kennel where dogs like him still wait. They sit behind bars, their eyes tracing the footsteps of strangers, hoping for a hand to reach out, a voice to call their name. Max found his way back to Claire, but countless others dream of a home they may never know. If his journey has stirred your heart, let it move your hands. Adopt a senior dog, give them the chance to feel the sun on their fur, the grass beneath their paws, the love they've waited a lifetime for. Their years may be few, but their loyalty is endless, their gratitude boundless. Share Max's tale, let it ripple outward, because every dog deserves an ending as tender as this, a chance to rest, at last, in the arms of someone who says, "You're home."